you think of Detroit, what do you see? Decay? Suburbs? Cars? Do you see the violence etched on the landscape, or has it become so ubiquitous that we are blind to it? Violence created this landscape. Racial violence, capitalist violence, it's endemic. When I think of Detroit, I see fences that tell undesirables that this house is occupied. Fences that tell people that this factory, hotel, building, or institution is closed for good. In the 1950s, Detroit was prospering. Stately turn-of-the-century homes housed families. Children were educated here. Anniversaries were celebrated. Art decorated the walls. How did that turn into this? What happened? Where did everyone go? Why did they leave? Detroit was destined to fail, destroyed by the very factors that built it. Detroit is now in ruins because of common American practices, a city built on a foundation of violent racism and exploitive capitalism. And the same crumbling foundation threatens other American cities. Detroit is a racially divided city. Hostilities brewed for over a century, with race riots erupting in 1833, 1863, 1925, and 1943. In the 1960s, African Americans across the country had had enough, and riots rocked major cities from east to west. After being violently pushed for centuries through slavery, sharecropping, Jim Crow, and discrimination, African Americans in the United States decided it was time to fight back. What had been subtle violence before, redlining, segregated unions, job discrimination, persecution by the police and authorities, turned physical. Over 5 days, 43 people died, 1,189 were injured, and over 7,000 people were in custody. This violence only served to heighten the existing tensions and to accelerate the flight of those with power and means to the outer suburbs. As white Detroiters moved out farther from the city center, the political weight and funding followed them, leaving an inner city with crumbling housing stock, insufficient schools, and a complete lack of investment even in basic services. The only service that the city seemed to fully fund was an ever-growing, heavily armed police force. Even when middle-class African Americans could afford to escape the violence of the inner city, they were kept out of the new suburbs. The building of a concrete wall at 8 Mile Road made manifest the racial dividing line. Some families tried to cross the color line. Once they made it through the prejudiced real estate market and neighborhood committees, they faced physical violence. In 1965, 25 crosses were burned on the lawns of black homeowners in white suburbs. The police did nothing. This separation of neighborhoods still exists today. While the city proper is 83% black, the suburbs are still predominantly white. This separation started centuries ago, and cities built on this foundation will always face the racial violence in its various forms, and this violence gets passed down from generation to generation. As long as this divide is maintained, whether through government funding patterns, racial profiling, or just plain ignorance, cities will face violence. And left unchecked, it can tear a city apart. Detroit was built around and for the automobile. Names like Ford, Chrysler, and Packard built the city. Detroit's rise to the top was meteoric, starting as a middling-sized town at the beginning of the 20th century. With Henry Ford, the Model T, and the promise of $5 a day, came a population boom. 528,000 people came to Detroit between 1910 and 1920. 575,000 came in the next decade. By 1950, Detroit was the self-proclaimed Motor City, boasting a population of 1.85 million people. And they thought it would go on forever.
Like a stout heart within the city is Detroit industry, the vital pulse beat of technology and resources which has put the world on wheels. Detroit's strategic location, its reservoir of know-how, its ability to deliver manpower, places it in the vanguard of choice spots in which to build, manufacture, and expand.
By 1965, when this video was made, both Studebaker and Packard had closed up shop, The city was separated along racial lines at 8 Mile, and the gap between the rich and the poor was getting wider every day.
Industry, backed by research in depth, proves Detroit is ever seeking the new way, the better way. Detroit shares, indeed leads in each forward stride today, as it builds for an even more prosperous tomorrow.
But prosperity means different things to different people. For the city, prosperity meant an ever-growing tax base. For residents, it meant good jobs, good homes, and good treatment. For businesses, it meant an ever-increasing profit margin. The auto industry, the only game in town, had already sown the seeds of Detroit's destruction. There would be no prosperous tomorrow. There would be no more growth. Capitalism itself is a violent and exploitive process. Those who own the means of production always have the upper hand. They use the labor of those without capital, and when a less expensive option presents itself, they move on. As technology progressed, factories began to require fewer workers. Unskilled labor jobs became harder to come by. Many jobs were lost to outsourcing. In addition, spending practices, changing markets, and economic fluctuations led many of the automakers perilously close to bankruptcy. By the time the federal government stepped in to bail out the auto industry, hundreds of thousands of workers had lost their jobs. Meanwhile, the capitalist machine kept rolling along. In 2012, the CEO of General Motors received a $7.7 million paycheck. And yet Detroit, cradle of the auto industry, is unemployed and in ruins. It is the cult of the bottom line, writ large on a landscape, violently etched into the very fiber of the city. This is Detroit today. You can read the city's violent history on its landscape. You have to read the landscape because the people are gone. Industry is all but gone, pulling up stakes and outsourcing to places with fewer regulations and lower labor costs, leaving a path of rubble and destruction in their wake. The suburbs, the last bastion of safety in a quickly crumbling city, remain mostly white, while the inner city remains mostly black. Residents who can leave have. Between 2000 and 2010, 237,000 people left Detroit. That's as if the entire population of Baton Rouge just picked up and moved to Cincinnati. 40 square miles of the city are vacant land, an area roughly the size of San Francisco. Residents who can't afford to leave are stuck in a city with no jobs, no services, and no way out. And the city is in no position to help either. Municipal government has been fraught with scandal and corruption for decades. Former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick is currently serving the first of a possible 30 years behind bars. For the last 4 months, an outsider has been in charge of the city, and his title begins with the word emergency. And recently, the city officially filed for bankruptcy, the largest U.S. city ever to do so. The city was destroyed by the same factors that built it. But Detroit is not the only city built on violent racism and exploitive capitalism. Perhaps the legacy of Detroit is a warning, a message to the next generation. What begins in violence ends in violence. Detroit is a modern-day Ozymandias. As those standing outside, we look upon a shattered visage of a former kingdom, lying in ruins and waste, in decay, proclaiming to us, "Look on my works, ye mighty," and despair.